The Everest Discrepancy by Emplemon.
Always remember, if you ain't first, you're last.
Columbus, Armstrong. To most, these names are remembered for one reason and one reason only.
Powder
They were
wakes.
each the first to accomplish something remarkable. The word first is one of the most frequently used adjectives in the English language.
Is it?
Out of all descriptive concepts, first may be the most important superlative. Words we use to express the highest degree of something. First is one of the most popular superlatives because it's so unambiguous. Being the first person to do anything is a big deal. All who follow you have no choice but to know your name. If you're the first to achieve something monumental, history will remember you long after you're gone.
Yeah, like Amelia Earhart, first woman to get eaten alive by coconut crabs.
Most superlatives end with the suffix est, a grammatical trait rather fittingly shared by the tallest mountain on the planet. Mount Everest is quite possibly the world's most famous landform. It towers nearly 9 kilometers above sea level and can be seen from over 300 kilometers away, equivalent to seeing New York City from Boston. It's a well-known fact that the first person to reach the summit of Everest was Sir Edmund Hillary in 1953. It's one of those pieces of trivia that gets thrown around so much that you just stop questioning.
I'm not even sure if I want to, like, mountaineering sounds cool, right? Climbing a mountain sounds cool, but I'm not sure if I'd ever want to climb up Mount Everest. It seems insane. It seems crazy. And the amount of people who die trying to do it is even more insane. Isn't Mount Everest just a pile of trash at the top? No, it's a pile of bodies at the top because people go up there and die because they freeze to death or some shit. It's not. There's no trash on Mount Everest though. If for them to bring trash to Mount Everest, you'd have to first get to the top of Mount Everest, which is in itself takes weeks, well, days. It's like it's not even worth putting trash up there. Even if you flew it up there, it's not worth it. Just put it somewhere else.
It seems like something that should be indisputable. The first man to set foot atop the tallest mountain. An unambiguous statement of fact. Except, 29 years before Edmund Hillary reached the top of Everest,
Chad, is that the reverse
chance,
flash?
but a chance nonetheless that someone else may have got their.
Chad, is that Zoom? He looks like
first.
He looks like Eobard Thawne. He looks like the original Eobard Thawne. I like the original Eobard Thawne.
The Western world first laid eyes on Everest in the middle of the 19th century, but it wasn't until 1921 when they first set foot on it. That year, the British Royal Geographic Society financed the first expedition to explore Everest and identify a route to the top. A leading member of the expedition was 34-year-old George Mallory, considered to be one of the most skilled climbers in Britain. Just 5 years prior, Mallory was fighting in the Battle of the Somme, where over the span of 5 months, the young men of Europe suffered more than 1.6 million casualties.
Jesus.
In 1922, Mallory was about to enter one of the few places on Earth that was even more inhospitable. For millennia, civilizations around the world have considered the highest mountains to be sacred grounds.
It's not
Anyone who dared to climb them would be trespassing in the realm of gods. No matter how superstitious you are, you can't deny that there are some places on Earth that human beings were never designed to go.
True.
Atop mountains like Everest, the terrain is so precarious that one misstep can result in a fatal fall.
Yeah, that's why I don't want to go to the top of fucking Everest. Why do people do it?
Hurricane-force winds, enough to blow any climber clear off the mountain. Any practical attempts to reach the summit have to be conducted in roughly a 10-day window before the annual monsoon season, when wind speeds are relatively calm. Usually this window opens towards the end of May, but even then, temperatures at the top of Everest struggle to break 0 degrees.
So you have a 10-day window
on exposed skin in minutes.
You have a 10-day window to climb Everest.
The frigid temperatures force climbers to seek shelter by nightfall.
That's pretty cool.
But even the welcome warmth of the sun presents its own challenges during the day. Ultraviolet radiation becomes much more potent at high altitudes. Combined with highly reflective snow, people on Everest are at constant risk of snow blindness and other debilitating eye problems. Even during optimal weather, conditions can change in an instant. Climbers can venture onto the Everest slopes on a clear day and suddenly find themselves stranded in blizzard conditions with nowhere to hide. As if that wasn't bad enough, the roving threat of an avalanche can wipe out an entire team of climbers in a matter of seconds. However, in spite of all the deadly hazards that await climbers at the top of Everest, the single most life-threatening factor has to do with what isn't there. At 29,000 feet, air pressure is 3 times lower than at sea level, meaning that climbers have access to only 1/3 as much oxygen. Mount Everest is one of 14 summits that extends above the 8,000-meter mark, otherwise known as the death zone. Beyond this altitude, the human body
fucking zone. Oh god.
No longer has enough oxygen to sustain itself, and within several hours, vital systems will begin to shut down. Climbers who enter this range are no longer flirting with death. They are literally in the process of dying. If anyone in the death zone fails to descend back to a safe altitude in time, their chances of survival are 0. The death zone presents an extreme complication by making any run towards the Everest summit a crucially time-sensitive event. Climbers must maintain a certain pace on the final ascent or else risk running out of oxygen. To make matters even more difficult, the thin atmosphere makes the act of climbing painstakingly slow. Most climbers near the summit have to stop to catch their breath after each individual step. The process is so exhaustive that summiters are expected to burn more than 15,000 calories, equivalent to the daily energy output of 7 people.
1,500
The peak of Mount Everest is in contention for
I should just go there for a workout. What the fuck? Just go up to the top every day. Lose 1,500 calories a day.
Single most hazardous place on the surface of the Earth. And 99 years ago, George Mallory was one of 6 climbers trying to get there. On May 19, 1922, Mallory led Howard Somerville, Edward Norton, and Henry Morshead on the first official attempt to reach the Everest summit. Across 3 days, the team trekked up the north side of the mountain, eventually reaching a record altitude of 8,225 meters before turning back. On May 24th, George Finch and Jeffrey Bruce set off on another attempt, this time making use of supplemental oxygen. On the 27th, Finch reached a new altitude record of 8,326 meters. Immediately, Mallory was eager to make his own attempt with oxygen, believing that it was his ticket to making history. While many of the exhausted climbers were hesitant to make a third attempt, Mallory's fascination with Everest had begun to turn into an obsession. On June 3rd, he convinced several climbers to follow him on a hastily improvised trek to the summit. They were joined by 14 Sherpa porters who were assisting in hauling equipment to the higher camps. The expedition was now running far too late, and the monsoon had begun dumping fresh snow on the Everest slopes. On June 7th, Mallory's party triggered an avalanche that buried 7 porters alive.
Oh, no.
The disaster would mark the immediate end of the expedition. Mallory was criticized by his peers for his recklessness, as his sudden mania for the summit had led to a severe lapse in judgment. After the failure of 1922, he would have to wait 2 more years until his next chance to conquer Everest. In the spring of 1924, the British expedition crew...
That's how it usually is. When you have like a goal in mind and you're like right there to achieve it, and it's so important, you usually just go crazy. And you just do anything in your power to reach that goal, right? Regardless of your own personal safety. When are you pulling an EDP type thing when you get 8 million subs? Yeah, I need enough subscribers, otherwise it won't be.
We're back in the Himalayas.
It won't be.
Mallory, Bruce, Norton, and Somerville had returned from the previous mission, this time being joined by newcomers Noel Odell and Sandy Irvin. Mallory was now 37. And reconciled that this expedition would likely be his last shot at reaching the world's highest peak. The May of 1924 featured historically poor weather conditions at Everest. Not wanting a repeat of the 1922 disaster, the group decided to overrule Mallory's original plan and attempt the summit without oxygen. The change frustrated Mallory, who now viewed oxygen as a necessity to reach the summit. On June 1st, Mallory and Bruce began their journey up the North Ridge. After less than a day, the pair disappointingly aborted their attempt after poor weather forced them to retreat.
Why would you
On June
not want to
2nd,
go with
Norton and
oxygen?
Somerville began their attempt, this time finding themselves in ideal weather as they marched higher up the mountain. By June 4th, the pair had made it all the way up to the Great Couloir before exhaustion and respiratory problems forced them to turn around. Edward Norton reached a new altitude record of 8,570 meters, just 280 meters beneath the summit. Mallory was originally scheduled to make one last attempt with experienced climber Noel Odell, but after the failed first attempt, Mallory decided to call an audible. Instead of Odell, Mallory would make his final run to the summit alongside the 22-year-old novice Sandy Irvin, who happened to be the most skilled oxygen technician among the expedition crew. Based on this attribute, it's clear what Mallory had in mind. On June 6th, Mallory and Irvin began their ascent, each bringing with them as much oxygen as they could afford to carry. The pair were trailed by Odell, who was taking photos about 1,000 meters farther down the slope. On the evening of the 7th, Mallory wrote a final correspondence to Odell before the run to the summit, saying to look out for he and Irvin near the summit skyline the next day. On the morning of June 8th, Odell eagerly waited for visual confirmation of the climbers, but Everest Peak for the moment was obscured by mist. Then, at 12:50 p.m., there was a sudden break in the cloud cover, allowing Odell to clearly see the summit. There, Odell witnessed two black dots scaling one of the rock steps on the northeast ridge, with one dot appearing to climb up and over the crest, just below the final summit pyramid. After 5 minutes, the mist rolled back in, and the two figures disappeared behind the clouds. This small fleeting moment would be the last time that George Mallory and Sandy Irvin were ever seen alive. Shortly after the sighting, a storm hit the mountain, and the two climbers did not return from their attempt. Odell, as the closest party member, hiked up to around 8,200 meters to search for them, but after 24 hours, he signaled the rest of the crew that no trace could be found. Mallory and Irvin had been lost to the mountain. The tragedy would soon be overshadowed by the burning question looming in everyone's mind. The two climbers were on the cusp of the single greatest achievement in the history of human exploration, and no one in the world knew if they had made it.
A new ad?
Welcome back, everyone, to a very special
That's what Emplemon looks like? What the fuck?
product placement. Today, the fine people at Bespoke Post have sponsored me
thank you,
on
man.
an expedition
I bought
to
10
become
of
the
them.
first
I bought
green
20.
man to climb the tallest mountain in
I bought
Florida.
30 of them. Thank you. You think Mount Everest is
Following
haunted?
the
Anything with a lot of people
1924
dying in
Everest
is haunted, so
expedition,
technically,
reporters
yeah.
were eager to find out whether
Technically,
the
yeah,
highest peak
Mount
in the
Everest is
world had
haunted.
been reached.
Yeah.
As the last people to see Mallory and Irvin alive, the other members of the expedition found themselves
My
in a
chair is
frenzy
so
of media
uncomfortable.
attention.
I need a better
Fellow
chair.
climbers Odell, Norton, and Somerville were under the consensus that the pair had reached the summit. However, the greater climbing community were far more skeptical, and future Everest expeditions would begin to raise major questions over the possibility of a successful attempt. Based on the testimony from Norton and Odell, the working theory was that Mallory and Irvin were attempting to reach the summit via the crest of the northeast ridge, a route which at that point had never been explored. Climbers of the time lacked the knowledge or experience to truly evaluate the difficulty of the route. A major complication that
Imagine a
Mallory and
ghost
Irvin would have had
tucking in
to
with
face
you when
was
you're
a
dying of
geological
oxygen
feature on the
deprivation.
ridge known as
I
the
bet it would
second
feel
step,
warm.
one of three
That'd be a very
prominent
warm
obstacles
ghost.
on the final run to the summit. At an altitude of 8,600 meters, the second step is a 40-meter tall near-vertical rock face that spans across the entire width of the ridge. Initially, it was claimed to be the rock step mentioned in Odell's eyewitness report, and was supposedly surmounted by one of the climbers in just 5 minutes.
It's not haunted, it's just that Illuminati has a secret base up there, and those who are strong enough to climb it get accepted. They have such an enormous expensive base that no one really wants to leave. That is a theory.
However,
You think
as
that-
future
no.
expeditions examined the second step,
No.
Odell's statement began to appear more and more dubious. The first climbers to definitively explore the second step arrived in the 1933 expedition. One member
Oh my god, it's so hot, chat.
described the rock face as utterly impregnable. Edmund Hillary's
Impregnable?
successful
I
summit
could
attempt in
impregnate it.
1953 did
Skinny
not
fat
have
sex
to
alone.
navigate the second step, as he reached the summit from the south side of the mountain.
Also, chat, is the video
The
too
first
loud
party
compared to
confirmed
me, or is it
successfully
good?
climb the second step was the 1960 Chinese expedition, which managed to overcome the obstacle using pitons, a climbing aid which Mallory and Irvin did not have. Even with superior tools, it still took the Chinese 5 excruciating hours to complete the climb. Future expeditions would install a ladder to make surmounting the second step somewhat bearable. Historical hindsight of the second step's extreme difficulty shed serious doubt on whether Mallory or Irvin could have feasibly climbed it back in 1924. Irvin, a novice climber, was almost certainly out of his depth. Only Mallory would have had a realistic chance of navigating the obstacle, but many climbers today question whether even that would have been possible. Modern-day mountaineers now use tiered grading scales such as the Yosemite Decimal System to assess the technical difficulty of climbing features. In the century since the 1924 expedition, several experts have successfully free-climbed the second step and have appraised the obstacle with grades ranging from 5.6 to 5.10. Based on Mallory's climbing history, his skill has been estimated at a grade of 5.9. Meaning that the second step may have been just within his capabilities. However, aside from his raw aptitude, Mallory would have also had to scale the step using rudimentary gear while hauling multiple oxygen canisters. Making an unassisted climb on an unexplored obstacle under all these circumstances would have required a superhuman effort, and to do so in the 5 minutes that Odell supposedly saw, it would have to have been one of the most unlikely miracles in the history of mountain climbing. It's for this reason why many have inferred that Odell did not see the two climbers surmounting the second step, but rather the comparatively easier first step. However, if this was the case, it would have provided the pair with another major complication. At the time Odell spotted the climbers, they were already 4 hours behind schedule. If they were as far from the summit as the first step in that moment, they would not have had enough time to reach the peak by sundown. Even if Mallory and Irvin had continued climbing into dusk, their estimated supply of oxygen would have likely run out. An additional problem working against the two climbers was the rapidly deteriorating weather conditions over the course of June 8th. Meteorological data gathered at the base camp during the expedition recorded a significant drop in barometric pressure between the 8th and 9th, which would have made the air near the summit even more thin. Everest climber Graham Hoyland extrapolated that on the day that Mallory and Irvin trekked to the summit, the drop in air pressure would have added the equivalent of 180 meters to the effective altitude of the mountain. Unfortunately, their summit date coincided with the arrival of that season's monsoon, and to get to the summit, the two climbers would have had to survive the storm that hit the mountain at around 2 p.m.
No.
A modern-day
I
thermodynamic
can't do
analysis
caves
of
either.
Mallory's
They're fucking
clothing
terrifying,
revealed
man.
that he would not have been insulated if the wind speed had risen by a significant degree, a scenario that he likely experienced in the June 8th storm. It's probable that this sudden change in the weather ultimately led to Mallory and Irvin perishing
I'm
on
more
the
scared
mountain.
like you
But
walk
for the
on some
moment,
snow and
without
then
any
you just start
knowledge of
falling
their
through the snow
whereabouts,
and then you
a
fall into a
specific
giant
cause
cave.
of death could not be determined.
No escape.
Eventually, though, as more expeditions ventured up the slopes of Everest, clues began to emerge over the fate of the two wayward climbers. In 1933, crew members discovered a lost ice pick just below the first step. The pick was eventually proven to belong to Sandy Irvin, who likely dropped it near the scene of the climber's fatal accident. Now that an artifact from the missing climbers had been recovered, researchers of the mystery concluded that their final resting place couldn't have been far. Due to the extreme cold near the Everest summit, bodies stranded atop the mountain don't decompose, allowing them to essentially remain frozen in time. In 1975, Chinese climber Wang Hongbao reported spotting a body at an altitude of 8,100 meters. Judging by their clothes, the remains must have belonged to a climber from an old British expedition. 24 years later, several researchers organized a search to locate the deceased climber. It was on that expedition that Conrad Anker discovered a corpse about 300 meters beneath the site of the lost ice pick. Lying there, face down in the snow, was the body of George Mallory. Mallory's remains showed evidence of 3 key injuries. He suffered a broken leg, a puncture wound in the skull, and bruising from a rope around his waist. The bruising indicated that Mallory and Irvin were likely roped together when one of them fell, snapping the rope and separating the duo. Mallory's injuries were not severe enough to indicate a steep fall. He may have experienced a minor stumble at the ice axe location, after which he descended further down the slope where he suffered a second, fatal fall. Several of Mallory's possessions were recovered from the scene, which revealed additional clues to the summit question. His climbing goggles were found stowed away in a pocket, indicating that he was likely operating in low visibility. Mallory was probably descending after the sun had set or during storm conditions. One of his pockets concealed a note with a list of 5 oxygen cylinders, providing evidence that the climbers had brought 1 extra cylinder than previously thought. In fact, the same search mission actually recovered one of these cylinders, an artifact which marked the highest confirmed point that Mallory and Irvin reached. Rumored to be among Mallory's possessions was a photo of his wife, which he planned to place at the summit. The photo was not found on Mallory's body, sparking further speculation to a successful attempt. But beyond speculation, no evidence could be found that conclusively proved whether he did or did not reach the summit. Many researchers hoped that finding George Mallory would finally provide a solution to mountaineering's greatest
I'm just
mystery,
enjoying this video.
but it may have only created more questions than answers. Today, nearly 100 years after the tragedy, climbing experts are still split on the fate
he
of
didn't
Mallory and
stumble
Irvin.
into his ice pick.
Seasoned
He
veterans
jumped
like
his ice
Conrad
pick,
Anker and Graham
stumbled, and then
Hoyland are
fell
of
down
the
the mountain.
opinion that they did not make
Would you
it,
buy a house that's
reasoning
cheap
that
but
the
it's haunted
duo
as
simply
fuck?
had too many
How
factors
haunted are we
working
talking?
against them.
That
Other researchers are
if you have like, is this little girls running down the hallways, the doors are being slammed all the time, and when I sleep I wake up paralyzed? Absolutely fucking not. Okay, but if like a cup drops on the floor every once in a while, and like maybe a door closes every once in a while, I'm chill.
more optimistic. Philip Summers notes an inconsistency in the number of sleeping bags accounted for on the 1924 expedition, and suggests that Mallory and Irvin may have carried 2 of them on their summit attempt, possibly as a means of attempting a bivouac to buy them more time. Michael Tracy offers a solution to the second step problem by suggesting that the climbers bypassed the obstacle entirely by using the North Ridge Traverse, which was the standard route at the time. Tracy presents a comprehensive explanation for how the pair could have followed this route while using a system of oxygen caching to reach the summit before sundown. In this case, Odell would have actually spotted the climbers at the 3rd step, which would be far more consistent with the supposed 5-minute climb. There are various other creative theories regarding Mallory and Irvin, but until further evidence surfaces, a definitive conclusion may never be reached. Fortunately, the mystery is not yet a hopeless cause, as the answer to the summit question may lie among the still undiscovered remains of Sandy Irvin. It's highly likely that if either of the 2 climbers reached the summit, they would have collected rock samples. The rocks found atop Everest are geologically unique to that part of the mountain. If Irvin were to be found with summit rocks, it would prove that one of the climbers had made it to the top of Everest. Curiously, the 1999 forensic search of Mallory's body neglected to check for summit rocks, so it remains unclear whether Mallory had any on his person. At the time, the prospect of rock samples had been completely overshadowed by the single most compelling missing piece from the 1924 expedition. As Mallory passed Howard Somerville on his final trek up the mountain, he asked to borrow Somerville's portable Kodak camera to capture photographs in the event of a successful attempt. When Mallory was found in 1999, the camera was not found among his possessions. Therefore, it is likely that Mallory handed off the camera to Irvin sometime during their descent. If the camera is ever located, the undeveloped film within could finally solve the mystery once and for all.
We have
Modern-day photographers have shown it's possible to develop 100-year-old film. It's unknown whether the extreme conditions atop Everest would corrupt the process, but in the event that the camera is found, Kodak provided special instructions to give the film its best chance at survival. But before any images can be retrieved, researchers will most likely have to locate the body of Sandy Irvin first. Xu Jing of the 1960 Chinese expedition claimed to have seen a dead climber lying on his back near the first step. Many researchers have inferred that this must have been Irvin, but subsequent searches of the area have thus far turned up nothing. Somewhere high up on the mountain, the missing piece of the Everest discrepancy is waiting to be found. But until that happens, all we have are the theories. There are many arguments for and against a successful summit attempt, but most of them hinge on one unknowable variable: whether George Mallory, while tantalizingly close to his defining achievement, would have chosen to turn back. Away from the mountains, Mallory had a beloved wife and children. After the 1924 expedition, he was known to have aspirations of becoming a writer. He certainly was in no position to throw his life away, nor endanger the life of his young climbing partner. However, the imposing allure of the Everest summit can have a strange effect on people. Many climbers who attempt Everest report a psychological phenomenon known as summit fever, where they become affixed in a trance-like state, compelling them to either reach the summit or die trying. Death was no stranger to George Mallory, who had witnessed the horrors of World War I, an event so traumatizing that it profoundly altered the way a generation of men understood the concept of life and death. Many soldiers who lived through the slaughter would go on to develop survivor's guilt, a condition where survivors of a mass tragedy experience sorrow and regret over not perishing alongside their peers. Death was so common in the Great War that many began to see valiant self-sacrifice as an expectation. It's possible that as Mallory was staring down his greatest adversary, he may have been thinking the same way. It's tough to think clearly in oxygen-starved conditions, and chasing the summit had already once enticed Mallory into a reckless decision. Considering what was at stake in that moment, one has to wonder whether the temptation was too much to resist. At the end of the day, the summit question may simply come down to the limits of human obsession.
I only know survivor's
But
guilt
as
because
far
of
as
Kendrick
any of us
Lamar.
are concerned,
How did he teach you about
does it
survivor's
really
guilt?
matter if Mallory or Irvin made it to the summit?
Yes!
Regardless
it
of
matters.
whether they succeeded or failed, we managed to reach the top of Everest anyway, and we did so long ago. We
Well-
have since reached the summit along every ridge and during every season. As of now, over 4,000 people have stood atop Everest, including a 13-year-old, an 80-year-old, a blind man, a double amputee, and in 1995, George Mallory, who conquered the mountain that took his grandfather's life all those years ago. Today,
Aw, that's a
climbers
nice
can
photo,
reach the
Anakin.
summit by following a fixed rope that extends all the way down to base camp. The summit trek has become so foolproof that practically anyone in good health with $50,000 and a few weeks to spare can reach the top of the tallest mountain in the world.
Why does it cost $50,000?
The summit trek has become so foolproof that practically anyone in good health with $50,000 and a few weeks to spare can reach the top of the tallest mountain in the world. What used to be considered the most astounding achievement in human exploration has since been relegated to a neat trophy to brag about at a cocktail party. It's somewhat disheartening to see how even a place as mystifying as Everest eventually found a way to be commodified and
What the
commercialized.
that's just way too many people. You're gonna cause an avalanche.
These days, it seems that there are hardly any frontiers left to explore. As of now, the greatest discoveries reside not in mountains, but in mysteries. We may never know for sure what happened to Mallory and Irvin, but pretty much all of us can be confident about one thing. No one would prefer if they had failed. It's a shame that history only tends to remember the first, because so many other remarkable stories and people get lost in the fold. Whether or not Mallory and Irvin made it to the summit, the fact remains that they both gave their lives trying to push the needle of human achievement. It's chilling to consider someone spending their final moments stranded high above the clouds with no hope of rescue. You
Yeah.
can only imagine how lonely it must feel. But in a spiritual sense, the greatest pioneers are never truly alone. While on the precipice of making history, all of mankind is with them. If they were to fail, so would the rest of us. Human beings are defined by challenging the unknown. The innate desire to explore unifies us all. We will not rest until every summit is reached and every question is answered. George Mallory put it rather succinctly back in a 1923 interview for the New York Times. When asked why he wanted to climb Everest, he simply responded with the three most famous words in mountaineering: because it's there.
I love that.